Hello, data storytellers. Today on the show, I have with me Andrew Brooks, who is leading data science at Torquata Data and Analytics, and we're going to have a fun conversation about all things data. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Fantastic. So I will have a bunch of questions for you about data science, where the industry is going. But first, just that we're all on the same page, both you and me and the audience. Would you like to make a quick introduction about Torquata Data and Analytics? So what do you guys actually do?
Sure. So Torquata Data and Analytics, essentially we are the connector of the automotive aftermarket. That's what our goal ultimately is. And we service several different types of customer groups. So tire manufacturers, distributors, as well as tire retailers. If you go to our website, you'll see that we have a suite of SaaS applications for tire retailers that help you do things like figure out what you stock in your store, how to optimally figure out what future demand is, what tires you should be putting in the store, as well as how to set your prices and various aspects of your operations. And we power that all through POS data that's shared when you sign up for the SaaS services. The idea here is that we've got several disparate players in the automotive industry in general, right? Specifically right now in the tire industry. And what we're trying to do is figure out ways we can take out inefficiencies from the industry through wider data sharing, through wider SaaS applications and analytics powered through this data to help every single participant in the industry. So we're a wholly owned subsidiary of American Tire Distributors, and we like to call ourselves kind of the customer-facing aspect of that. So we originally started out as a very small unit, the Center of Excellence Analytics at American Tire Distributors for about 2 years. We built a bunch of SaaS applications that we found would probably be very relevant, not just internally at ATD, but also to tire retailers. And that's when ultimately we became an LLC, wholly owned subsidiary of ATD.
Okay, that's really cool. So basically, American Tire Distributors wanted to optimize how they do their own business internally by leveraging their data. That became this data center of excellence. And then as a move, and correct me if I'm wrong, but then as a business strategy move, you guys looked at how you can monetize your data capabilities by actually creating an entity on its own. And now you are seeking out external customers to help them leverage that data like American Tire Distributors did in their own house.
Yeah, that's exactly, you put it better in words than I did.
I like to just dumb it down for the audience, not because the audience is dumb, but because it's good to just actually understand from a strategic point of view what the business is doing, right? And translate it into a language that's maybe a little bit less technical. It's not like you did an overly technical introduction by any means. So that's really cool. You started at American Tire Distributors in 2018. Can you maybe just give me a little bit of a rundown of your background? So I see that you've been a postdoctoral researcher at Emory University in Atlanta. And what led you to the data science profession more specifically?
Yeah, it's kind of a long path, but ultimately, after undergrad, during undergrad, so I'll start way back in college. I'll skip all high school and everything like that, so we're not here for years. But in undergrad, I really had a lot of interest in the way that the human mind works, right? So think about all those questions about whether consciousness is in the brain or whether it's separate from the brain. Just had a lot of interest in biopsychology. And naturally, I decided that when I graduated, I wanted to dive much deeper into that. And the best way to do that is to get a PhD studying the brain. And so I applied for a bunch of different programs, ended up at Emory University to get my PhD in neuroscience. Originally, and my story could have come out totally different. We may have not been on this podcast if I had made one separate decision, which was when I was first trying to figure out what lab I wanted to be in to study some of the questions I was interested in. I tried out to be involved in a wet lab. So that's like working with mice and rats and so on and so forth. And I found literally after the first week, I could not do that. It's just not, it's not really my interest. I'm not built out for that. And so I switched to a lab that was studying human decision making. And that kind of changed the course of everything, because ultimately what I was doing in that was a lot of statistics, which you certainly do in wet labs as well, right? But there was a lot of computational aspects of what I was doing. So studying the human mind using functional magnetic resonance imaging, essentially how do people make decisions over finances? And in order to do that, there was a lot of involvement with just building out experiment pipeline code, right? And then figuring out ways to automate the analysis. Because at the time, the data felt like it was big, nothing compared to what it is today. But at the time, it felt like the data was quite big. And I realized through all of that research that, yes, I was interested in the research questions, like where in the mind do people make financial decisions, where are the losses, gains tracked in the mind. But really, I was more interested in the computational aspect of what I was doing, right? Kind of the coding part, the statistics part, the computational, all of that, less so than the research questions. And so at the time, we started working on kind of a tangential body of research during my postdoc, which you'll see, it's interesting because we started to pivot to how canines, what's going on in the dog brain, basically. We train dogs to go into fMRI scanners with no restraints and no drugs or anything like that, just train them to do that. To try and uncover what's going on, in your dog's mind. And during that, started to get my foot into a little bit of machine learning in the sense of classification. Well, I would say predictive analytics, right? Before we were doing a lot of regression to explain things, but now we had moved beyond that into more of the predictive analytics aspects. And that's when data science was becoming kind of blowing up at the time. It was those articles of this is the hottest new job, data science, right? And I'm sitting here as a postdoc thinking, well, I don't know ultimately if I'm that interested in the research questions. So now is the opportunity to kind of jump into industry, right? To see if this is what I need. This certainly my interest. And so I made that pivot over. It took a lot of effort to jump from academia into industry. For many reasons, because the tools are different and, folks are looking for a different background, when you're hiring data scientists or whatnot. And and joined on with Scientific Games as their first data scientist. And then my career kind of moved on from there. At Scientific Games, I was the first data scientist who joined on. I spent about 2 years there, not just building out their data science team, but also, working hands-on with several of their forecasting models. And then that's when I moved to ATD, and here I am now.
Really interesting. It actually resonates with me a lot. I mean, this podcast is not about me, but I have a similar background in terms of after the military, I wanted to go to university and study philosophy and physics, exactly because of some of those topics, including consciousness, right? And the nature of consciousness, theory of mind, studying time and all that kind of stuff. So that attracted me immensely. I always like these philosophical / theoretical topics. But then during that time, just to prepare for university, I jumped into the London startup scene. And there were a lot of exciting things happening, especially in the field of marketing technology, data analytics. And kind of similar to you, what really started to attract me was the application of these things. I love studying the mind. And even if you look at our logo, right, it's the human mind cut in half, kind of the right brain and the left brain. Right? I know. I know that I'm talking to someone who studied the brain, and this is kind of like a primitive image of the brain, but on a functional level, it kind of works. The more statistical brain and the more creative side of the brain. I don't know if you know Ian McGilchrist and his work. That's the master and the emissary. Now, not to get too far into that, but what I started to be really interested in is human decision making. Now, for me, probably also because of my personality, what I really liked is the business aspect of this, right? So people make decisions. Why do they make decisions? What really result in healthy relationships? How do you create trust over time and actually facilitate collaboration that produces more value throughout the entire decision-making chain? Now, you're looking at more the data and statistical side. So it's actually a good interplay. So At American Tire Distributors, what was your role specifically? So you spent 3 years there in that role, Senior Director of Data Science. That's a senior role. Okay. What were you doing? Was it super hard data, statistical stuff, or did you have to do more business-oriented activities as well?
I mean, when we started out as a group at American Tire Distributors, I joined on as employee number 3. So it was a really small group, all data scientists, right? So there were no software engineers, there were no data engineers at the time. And data scientists kind of had to do everything end to end. So when I joined on as a principal data scientist, individual contributor, hands-on work. And what we would do is we would meet with various business stakeholders from around the company and kind of talk with them about what the problems are and whether or not data and analytics could help solve some of those problems, right? So all of our data scientists were involved from the get-go at formulating, figuring out what the problem is, what needed to be solved, and whether it be, feasible, whether we could come up with feasible solutions to those problems, right? And so we would come back after meeting with business stakeholders and start building out proof of concepts. So I did a lot of hands-on coding work, meet with the business stakeholders again after having a proof of concept, and then kind of iterate on that cycle. And then finally, actually put models into production. So all the data scientists may have come on with, only a mindset of statistics, right? But then they very quickly, and I very quickly, had to pivot into putting my business hat on, right? And understanding business stakeholders, understanding the terminology too, to be honest, right? When I joined American Tire Distributors, I'd only been in industry probably about 2 or 3 years, right? Outside of project scientist for Dogstar Technologies. And so I wasn't familiar with a lot of the terminology that people use in business, just to be frank, right? So there was a lot of learning in that aspect, more so than just the modeling aspects of things we did. So very hands-on the whole time, up until about 2 years in when I got promoted to the Senior Director of Data Science. And in that role, it was still, I'd say, about 40% hands-on work, but a little more making sure that all the components of what we were doing, we usually had like one project per data scientist at the time, was just making sure that we're moving as a cohesive group, right? Kind of figuring out the connections of, if I'm building out something here and building out something here, how do they talk to each other? And making sure that with our business stakeholders, we're actually solving the problems that they need and kind of proving the value of this small group of data scientists to the company. And of course, when you do that, you kind of lean in much heavier into the side of needing to be persuasive and somewhat sell ideas, work better with language in general. I mean, just again, the business language was a lot of work for me. But yeah, that's ultimately where I ended up in that senior director role. And I'd say now at Torqated in data and analytics, I still try my best to keep some hands on the keyboard in terms of solving problems, but that's mainly just because I'm interested in it. I'll come in at night after a day of being in meetings with stakeholders and then sit down at the computer and be like, well, I kind of wanted to try out that forecast model because it's just interesting to me. And I'll do that for an hour in the evening just for fun. But I think it's helpful to do that, to stay close to the data, even if you're kind of higher up at the strategic level, trying to figure out how we operate, at a strategic versus operational level.
This always comes up, this language barrier issue. Actually, when I, in the beginning of the conversation, I told you that I like to dumb things down. That's actually one of the reasons, because that's a reflex that developed, I think, over years. Because when you have technical capabilities and technological capabilities and people who work with this all the time, that is a way of thinking. And then the business has a completely different way of thinking. They are ultimately, and sometimes it's a hard pill to swallow for data people, that the business doesn't actually really care about data analytics, right? That's not what they care about. They might love data analytics and what it can do, but they are ultimately interested in their outcomes. And just like everyone else, the business is also self-interested. And that's not a bug, that's a feature that actually helps things move forward. It's not about the flashy algorithms and the flashy, beautiful, elegant solutions, but it's about what will it do for the business. And then it's great if it is actually also elegant, just like an Apple computer. It's great that if you open it up, it's beautiful inside and it's amazingly well-made and aesthetically pleasing and all that stuff. But ultimately what you want is for that to deliver an outcome in an efficient, consistent, and powerful way. Same is true for data.
I was going to say, at my first job, I have a perfect example of this, where I went in as an individual contributor, and one of my tasks was to build out this forecasting model, right? And so I wanted to prove that this model was better than the existing one that was there. And so I had a maybe 15-page PowerPoint deck, maybe it was 20 pages, where 4 or 5 of the pages were just diving into the metric that we were using, right? On how I'm comparing the models, right? Going way into the details, because that was what fascinated me. I was so excited about that. I thought that I did a fantastic job of translating everything. And then after the meeting, I had someone pull me aside and just be like, hey, that was great. But sometimes we don't necessarily need to know how the sausage is made. Just kind of show, kind of summarize it, show us what the impact is on the business, not necessarily, kind of deep in the weeds. So, which kind of deflated me a little bit, but I'm like, I made that connection. Like I understand that data and analytics is kind of a means to an end, right? It's not for data scientists, it's because it's our passion, right? But for the business, it really is a tool to meet, some kind of goal that the organization has set. And that's really the mindset that you got to come in with, especially for data scientists who have to have their hands kind of in everything. Sometimes, spending 80% of your time trying to clean up data. Well, why am I doing this if I want to be spending time on the models? Well, it's kind of for the greater picture, right? But
absolutely, and it's interesting. It's interesting that kind of like an advanced technique, but sometimes you can dazzle the business stakeholders with some really in-depth technical knowledge, but it needs to take place at the right time, in the right place, with the right people, and needs to be short and punchy. This is actually what we call a flash roll. Again, this might be a little bit more advanced, something that we usually talk about in the community, but as a rule of thumb, you always want to talk in a way that a 5-year-old would understand. We talked about physics, right? So the Feynman technique, Richard Feynman, he was famous for it, as the best educators always apply the Feynman technique, which is exactly that: talk in a way that a 5-year-old would understand. And it doesn't matter that you're talking to people with an average IQ of 130 and 40 because they are senior business stakeholders, or data scientists who all have PhDs. When you want to move things forward, you got to take the effort of making things short, making things punchy and easy for the brain to process, because there are only so many concepts that the brain can be exposed to over the day and efficiently deal with it, right? And you make it easy. That's the effort that you put in.
Yeah, and you also have to realize from any perspective, right, that if you're a data scientist and you're kind of trying to convey your results to business leaders across the group, you got to realize that that's not like their whole day, right? They don't have the whole day necessarily to think about that one problem. They're faced with a lot of different decisions during the day. And so you want to make sure that your results and what you're trying to drive is very easy to compact into that, 1 hour period, 30-minute period, and come up with ways to convey the information that really stick in the mind, right? Otherwise it gets lost among the noise of all the other daily decisions that go on. And I think that's an art to figure out how to do that. It really is an art. And it takes time to learn how to do it.
Exactly. Ultimately, it is the art of storytelling. Of course, we like to use storytelling. It's a good buzzword, by the way. It's good for people to pay attention to. It's also almost quirky, but it's trending. And at the end of the day, it is truly powerful. So if you know how to storytell well, that just means that you can communicate efficiently and you make things easy for the stakeholders. That's ultimately what's happening. So we talk a lot about leadership postures, different leadership postures. Like if you're a leader of an initiative, what kind of attitudes should you have? What kind of virtues you should develop? And one is actually humility, because a lot of times someone not putting in the effort to empathize with the audience and speak in a language that they can understand, a lot of times it can come from arrogance. I mean, it's a harsh word. I'm not saying that it's a conscious thing. It's more like arrogance of the intellect, almost, right? Yes, absolutely. And then sometimes it is good to dazzle the audience with some technical knowledge, but only if you apply it right in your storytelling structure. So you talk to the business, you focus on their outcomes, their desires, their concerns. You talk in a way that would allow them to see the risks and opportunities and priorities really clearly. And when it comes to what you can actually deliver and what you want to do for them, to demonstrate your technical know-how and your competence in the field, you can drop what we call a threshold when you just actually explain that, okay, all these outcomes will be done by, and then 2 minutes of highly technical knowledge that you already know that is well prepared. And that actually facilitates trust and confidence in your abilities. But again, your whole presentation can be about that.
I think that's a super important quality for people, for leaders to have, right? And we don't always talk about it, which is humility. And the definition that I've heard about humility is that it's not thinking about yourself as less than who you are, right? Or not thinking about yourself as more. It's thinking about yourself at the right size level, right? And I think it's important to have confidence about what you're conveying, right? Confidence in your team's abilities, confidence in what you're doing, but also realize that sometimes if you push that too hard, you come across as arrogant, or like you're trying to tell other folks what they need to do, as opposed to work with them. And I think that's why one aspect of when you first join an organization is to really understand how it works. Like, what is the product you're building? The people on the ground, how are the tire retailers actually working day to day? Because if you come in without having that knowledge, you're going to try and push solutions that probably don't work in that context, but B, also look like you're just coming in to tell them what to do, and you don't necessarily have any background in it. So I think it's incredibly important to come from humbleness, just like you said, and understand from the other point of view.
And you see, again, this is so funny because we started having these conversations with senior data leaders around like 3 years ago. And we were interested in the technical side and the technology, of course. And we engaged in these conversations with senior professionals. And we expected that we will talk mainly about technology. And it turns out that these things just keep coming up after years and years and years, which is humility, which is empathy. And it's so surprising that, aren't we supposed to talk about data? So why are we talking about humility? Well, that's exactly it. And it's not like your technical knowledge is irrelevant or unnecessary. Absolutely not. It is essential and it is vital, but it needs to work in conjunction, in synergy with your more human, creative type of thinking. Again, we're talking about the two hemispheres of the brain. Even with humility and virtues, a lot of people think that assertiveness that you mentioned, I think, as confidence in your abilities and what your team can do and what you can offer. So we can call that assertiveness of, okay, I know what I want and I would like to make that happen. I would like to assert that on the business for the benefit of everyone involved, but also I need to stay humble. And a lot of people think that these are mutually exclusive, but this is the art. When you learn how to use these in a way that would facilitate more collaboration, more trust, and better results. Your way of empathizing with the business, I imagine that you came from a research background, and based on what you told me, and this is a common pattern too, that your role started to evolve in a way where it was very, very technical. Back in your researcher years, it's highly academical as well, and it just moves more towards business and moves more towards outcomes and relationships and people and empathy and all kinds of things. Now, during that time, how do you think that your approach changed towards understanding others, finding out about their priorities? What is your method here? Are you focusing more on your own research, digging into the business, browsing through papers within the organization? Do you like to sit down with people? What is your strategy and method here?
That's a great question. So I'm going to try and back up for a second because I want to touch on something that you said before, but I think it's all connected, which is there's a lot of digital transformations going on, right? It's kind of, we keep talking about buzzwords, but I also think it may be a buzzword, digital transformation. It's a real thing. And I had this deep fear that many of these digital transformations or these data and analytics initiatives are going to fail, right? And it's going to paint a bad picture of data science in general, right? And I had that fear because I think sometimes we miss the kind of outcome-focused role of data and analytics because a lot of academics come into the field with that kind of deep-seated interest of the research part, right? And I think there's a balance here, right? That description of the process you just talked about, coming in from a research background and then learning how the business works, and then finally you're operating at 100% in coordination with what the business needs, I think it's hugely important. And yet it took me years to get to that point, right? I think the first thing is for me to realize that outcomes matter, right? That 80%, 80-20 rule, like getting to the 80% solution really is important. And that if I have a business stakeholder who has a problem, for example, with trying to figure out where they want to put the sellers, where they want their sellers to focus on, like what customer they want their sellers to focus on. So you build a churn upsell model, right? A model that predicts whether somebody's going to stop, using your services or they're more inclined to use it more, right? It tends to be one of the low-hanging fruit models that people build as part of digital transformations. I think that's a good example where you could go down the path of spending a whole lot of time doing R&D to figure out the most possible sophisticated model with 1,000 features or whatnot, using deep neural networks and so on and so forth, to try and figure out, squeeze out every little bit of accuracy you can, when you could probably just build, a very simple tree-based or regression model, right? That'll get you 80% there. And so I think it's important to realize that. Early on, I wanted to dive into the more sophisticated models, but really you should figure out that 80% rule, right? And it's kind of cliche these days for people to say that. Well, you don't need deep neural networks; you can just use this. But I think that's hugely important, and that's one of the differentiators from when I first dove in to where I'm at now. And I think that also leads into another topic, which I'd love to talk about, which is now there are platforms where it doesn't really matter how sophisticated the algorithm actually is, whether it's basic or sophisticated. Just run all of them and figure out which one does best, and you're good to go. And you can do that in a couple of days, right? We're kind of constantly evolving as a field to where those things are possible when they weren't several years ago. So that's one aspect of doing that. Two is being close to the product and understanding why you're building what you're building, right? And I already said this before, and I hope it's not cliche, but it's important to understand who your customer is, right? Whether you're working internally with business stakeholders or you're building something, for your external customers, it's important to understand what their needs are, because at the end of the day, they don't necessarily care what algorithm is driving the results. What they do need to understand is that it's probably better than what was done before, if anything was done before, and that there's a great team behind that and that you can actually see the results, which is something that is not always necessarily apparent, right? In the sense that you can build a model that's 90% accurate, but if you build it into a tool and you don't do any POCs or pilot studies, and the person who's actually using the tool has been doing something for a certain way 10 years using their intuition. Now you add a tool which helps them out, takes some of that intuition into a model and gives recommendations on what you should do. Well, that's still only 90% accurate. You're still going to have time when the model tells you something and it's wrong. And the customer takes that recommendation, it turns out to be wrong, right? And then they ditch the tool. If you don't have a close relationship to be able to say, look, 10% of the time, the recommendations may not be right, but if you're going off of your intuition, maybe your accuracy is like 70 to 80% correct, right? And to have people to continue to trust the tool and keep using it, even after a couple misses, is really important. And you can't do that if you're kind of sitting on the sidelines and you're not actually interacting with the business unit very, very closely.
It's really cool that you mentioned the 80-20 rule, because as you said, it might be cliche. Well, it is, and it's an incredibly important cliche that needs to be reiterated all the time. I know, we build multiple businesses here, and I still need to come back to that all the time, every day. It's like a mantra, 80-20. What's the 20% here that will give me 80% of the results? How can I get rid of the rest? And how can I just focus on that? Again, it takes effort. It's kind of like a mental posture. But when you start engaging in that, suddenly things start to happen. Suddenly everyone is surprised by the results that you're producing because it's just so efficient. Now, it's actually even in our masterclass that we built for the data analytics leaders who want to become better storytellers. The 80-20 is one of the key elements. So we keep talking about it. I have a whole module on that, by the way. It's called the Pareto principle, right? And when you talk about being on the front lines and really understanding what people want, what kind of solution can you build that will be in harmony with the outcomes that they are looking for. So are you talking to people more now than when you started data science? Were you more closed in to your own team, and did you spend more time on the computer? And are you spending more time now with actually talking to people and key stakeholders? If you look at the couple of years that you spend there, how would you say that this posture and attitude changed on your end?
That's a great question. So it's hard to isolate one specific aspect of how I've changed over the years, because the team has also changed too, right? We started out as a team of only 3 people, where there were data scientists doing everything from talking to the business stakeholders to deploying the models. And now we're about 70 people with a very mature, product organization that's been built out, and a comms organization, right? Where there are people whose job it is to interact with the customer and make sure that they can capture every single aspect of the problem we're trying to solve for the customer, right? So these are through various sessions, right? And there's certain tools that I was never even aware of that product teams can utilize, to figure those things out in a very structured way. Whereas when we were doing that as data scientists, it was more just a quick conversation and taking notes, right? Where there's more structured ways to do that. So I would say today, from an actual timing standpoint, I'm probably talking to the actual customers of end users of what we're building, probably the same amount, but it's much, much more efficient than what it was before, because I know the right questions to ask, whereas before is much, much more vague on, hey, expecting the customer to tell me exactly what I need to build for them, as opposed to me figuring out what the problem is and figuring out what the best solution would be. So I'm not sure if that answers the question specifically, but yeah, it's just much more efficient at it, right? We have the structure to properly, triage these problems that come in, the things that we need to build.
Mm-hmm.
So
it actually does answer the question, and I would love to, because I would love to find out more about what you mentioned about the solutions that allows you to test. So I want to spend time on that, but this is such an important question of asking the right questions from the business, and the fact that you said that you became more efficient in this, it's not necessarily that you spend just more time with them, but you get more bang for your buck. And actually both of you, because the business stakeholder will be the same. He will get more out of that 30 minutes that he spends with you. Now, that's a really interesting question for me, and probably one of the most valuable things that our audience can hear and learn more about. So not to get too technical in this, and I completely understand that there are different people. You will not ask the same questions. It's not kind of like a one size fits all type of thing. But why do you think it became more efficient, your approach to this? What kind of questions you're asking now that you haven't asked before? If you wanted to compare the type of communication that you've had before earlier in your career and that you have now, that kind of gap between you being more efficient now and delivering more value through better communication and your fresh post researcher days, how do you think that changed? What kind of questions are you asking the business stakeholders now?
The first thing is, I would say that I'm actually asking questions, right? Because early on, it was easy to just sit in a meeting and have a business stakeholder kind of lay out roughly what problem they're asking us to solve, just in a very general aspect. And then to leave the meeting without having dug into more aspects of what they're thinking about, right? To literally just not ask enough questions. So that's the second thing, is to spend time asking questions. Now, what questions do you ask? The first thing to me is figuring out if it's a problem that, if the problem is defined really well. Like when you walk into the business meeting, is the problem already defined? Is there a deliverable that business stakeholder already has in mind? For example, with the churn upsell model, the business stakeholder says, look, I need to efficiently allocate my salespeople over to various accounts. How do I figure out what account I should have them on to best maximize, retention or whatever quality you're trying to maximize? Then that's a pretty clear deliverable to me, right? You want to provide them with a sheet that indicates what account should be tackled, right? Forgetting the integration aspect, which we should talk about, because that's one thing that's always been difficult, which is you can build all this stuff, but how do you actually integrate it day to day with the workflow? Because that could be extremely difficult and make or break something. But I think those problems are easier when it's very clear what the outcome is. The problems where it's much wider and much more ambiguous is when you really need these design thinking sessions, right? Kind of whiteboarding sessions. And there's various ways to structure these things. For example, I'm taking a Luma certification, which is a design thinking workshop that kind of helps you learn how to get into these, what I call whiteboarding sessions with a business stakeholder, and then start to hone in on the various aspects of what they're asking, right? Taking an ambiguous problem, or maybe a problem that is not ambiguous, which is we need to reduce volume in our warehouses, and then actually breaking it down into digestible components, right? So I would say a lot of the questions that we have are just a lot more pointed on what they want to solve and a lot more hands-on and interactive than it is just walking into a meeting and then having them spill out what they're talking about, going back and trying to figure out how to solve it, right? It's much more interactive. And I think the more back and forth you're able to have with business stakeholders, probably the better you are, you know, in terms of what you're going to build out, what your solution is going to be, this iterative process. What we like to talk about too is coming up with example deliverables, right? So if somebody's asking for, saying, hey, I have this type of problem that I need to solve, can your data science team help solve it? And if we have a rough idea of what a deliverable might be, whether it's, you know, an Excel sheet listing accounts and which ones you should focus on, to actually go create that as a POC early on, send it to the business stakeholder and have them review it and say, this is what I'm thinking about. Because they may say, well, actually, now my mind's changed a little bit. Can we do it this way? And then that's that iterative process. And I found that I'm much more amenable now in understanding that that's the way things work. It's actually not, it's not bad that you have to go back and clarify questions, right? It's just not. That's important to have this iterative process and be in connection with your stakeholders at every step of the way. And I think early on, coming in from academia, where I may get a research problem and then go into the office and spend the next couple of months trying to solve this problem, it's much different in business where you need this iterative process, right? And I'm also learning from our product managers who have who are trained in it, who have a lot of knowledge on that front, on how to run these design thinking sessions and how to hash out the details of a problem and figure out how we, tackle it.
No, this makes a lot of sense. And you said something very interesting about the integration and implementation issue. So let's say you nailed it. You did your due diligence, you understood the business, you put in the effort, you had a great back and forth iterative process, you applied design thinking on conceptualizing the right solution and then coming up with it, you built it. What kind of challenges usually come up during the integration phase to make sure that it works well with the day-to-day of the business?
Many, many challenges. And I think thinking about integration early on during those initial sessions, super important. So imagine that you're building a tool for somebody in the business or whatnot. Let's just talk about an internal use case here, right? Or internal use case. And they have to log into 3 or 4 different websites or different tools throughout the day to do their job. And you come in as a data and analytics team and say, hey, we can help with this one problem that you have, but it's going to require you to log into a 5th, website during the day, right? And that may not seem like a lot. Okay, it's one additional tool you got to log into, but during the day, all that time to do that context switching adds up, right? You really should be investigating whether some of your modeling outputs can actually be integrated into the existing tools that are being used. And so it's funny because one of the first projects that I had at American Tire Distributors was something where we were trying to actually figure out how to get it out to the field, right? And there are various ways we could do this. We could build a web app. We could build potentially a mobile app. There's just various things that we could build. But at the end of the day, what we did was we built it in Excel. I mean, we literally had an Excel file that was using macros to call a REST endpoint and then do all the computation, spit it back into Excel. Why? Because that's what the sellers used in their workflow, right? And it took off and it was fantastic. And it had a very tangible, measurable impact on the business. And I think not because it was a super sophisticated tool or because there was, heavy statistics involved, but just because it was something people could actually use and people were willing to use and it integrated with their workflow. And if you ignore that, then you're going to dump a bunch of money into sophisticated algorithms and platforms that never actually see the light of day or never actually used in decision-making on the ground. And I think that is something that's just super important. Use existing tools, or as a company, if you're deciding to switch to a different platform, then make sure that everybody is on board with that, including the folks who need to be informed by those models when they make decisions.
And this might be connected to what you mentioned earlier that you would like to talk about, which was, I'm not sure if I captured it correctly, but it was something about how you can launch different solutions at the same time and then kind of test what works. Did I capture that? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think the testing aspect of what you're doing, like pilots and then measuring whether they actually work, super important. Right? Super important, especially in data science and analytics, where I can't count the number of times I've been in a room and just had an awesome session ideating on potential things that we could do, right? Potential models we could build and that could move the business forward. And then when you actually build them out, you realize, well, there's so much noise in the data that it doesn't actually work, right? I think more so than, say, figuring out new features for some kind of application that's not data science related, where it's going to work, you just have to build it. That's not the same thing with machine learning models or statistics in general, right? Because you don't really know if it's going to work until you try it in general. Of course, experience can help inform all of that, and knowledge of statistics and knowledge of modeling can also help inform that. But at the end of the day, you just have to try it, right? So there's a high failure rate for a lot of these ideas, and you need to make sure you're in a space where that's okay to do that. I would say part of that is actually measuring. So let's say your model does hit an accuracy metric that we need. Well, that's great. But now we need to know, does the integration that we set up work, right? Does our delivery mechanism, is it actually going to inform the decisions on the ground? So we should roll it out to a small subset of people or a small subset of locations or whatever it is and actually test it, right? This comes from the hypothesis testing background in research, right? Where you probably want somebody on your team who can run some simple t-tests or regressions, right? To figure out whether or not something actually worked at the end of the day. Because it's not good enough to just build a model with high accuracy and then deploy it across the board to everybody without figuring out whether, it actually works or not. I think A/B testing in that context, right? There's a little less, I don't know if I can't see a scenario where you build, several different types of models and then A/B tests, on the ground, which one works. But if you're trying to figure out, in your web page, whether you show, A or show B, then that's, kind of that rapid A/B testing process like you talked about. But I think what I was getting at was really do POCs, run pilots, do the statistics on it to figure out whether that pilot change the KPI that you're looking for. And if it didn't, then try something different and rapidly iterate that way.
That makes a lot of sense. So as a final topic that I would like to touch on is really what we coin as the decade of data. So a lot of people talk about this, that the 2020s will be the decade of data. Everything has been leading up to this. There was a lot of hype, and data has been trending for almost a decade now, and it really reached that state of maturity where businesses are actively investing in it, and it's actually happening. This whole mirage of the data-driven organization, it's actually becoming a reality in many businesses. At the same time, we now see the points of friction. Now we see the bottlenecks and the biggest challenges. And also there is this thing called data fatigue setting in, and a lot of risk that you mentioned, that people coming in with heavily academical perspectives can really tire out the business and just kind of push data to the sidelines because people just can't understand it, can't really work with it. There are competing business priorities, there are competing narratives, and you're running the risk of making data like a marginal kind of cool thing, a nice to have, and not the essential that we would like data to be. And it definitely has the potential to be one of the highest impact functions in the business. So how do you see the industry now moving into the 2020s as things accelerate? There'll be a lot of losers, probably a few winners who manage to nail this. Where do you see the biggest opportunities and risks in the data analytics industry today?
That's a great question. I made the comment before where I had this fear that a lot of digital transformations may fail or initiatives in data and analytics. To be really clear, I think that as a company, if you aren't investing in your data and analytics and being data informed, right, when you make decisions, you're going to fall behind. Like there's no question that is what's going to happen going forward, right? Everything's going to be digital. And if you're not investing in that, you're going to fall behind one way or another, right? Even if your initiative that you drop money into fails, right? If you decide not to try another way around, I think that you'll be left behind. So to be clear, regardless of hype or no hype, I think understanding your data and helping it drive your decisions is absolutely critical to to compete just in general. I would say some of the challenges is data quality, for example. Data quality is a huge challenge. I don't think people realize how difficult it is to actually utilize this data in models when you don't really know exactly what it's representing. When I've joined multiple organizations, and everybody seems to, across the board, be actively building a data lake, right? Or actively building a warehouse where all the data is in one spot, and nobody's actually successful. Well, people have successfully done it, but it's always an active process, right? Where data has to take a top stage in the organization. And if it doesn't, right, and you bring in an analytics team and your data is disparately spread across the organization, I think you'll be in trouble, right? So investing in data engineering, BI teams, data warehousing, all of that, incredibly important. Otherwise, you're going to hamper your analytics team in general. So I think that's one challenge. I think jumping too quickly into the extraordinarily difficult use cases versus tackling low-hanging fruit from within an organization is probably the wrong way to go. Like there's an aspect of it where you do want to do that 20% R&D time where you can do the cutting edge research, not just to show everybody in the industry that your company is really doing the cutting edge research and making sure data scientists enjoy what they're doing, but you also want that 80% rule again. You want some of those low hanging use cases where you can say, look, our analytics team practically moved the needle on all of these KPIs from within the organization. And if you don't do that, then obviously people are going to lose faith in data analytics, data science, AI, whatever terminology you want to use, if you can't actually tie it down to individual KPIs. And so I think that's super important. I'm also seeing a lot of platforms that are maturing a lot. So AutoML, also MLOps platforms are maturing. So you don't necessarily have to come in with a super deep knowledge of programming. And I'm being careful with how I phrase this, right? But I do think there are tools out there that can really help accelerate data scientists' work, right? And being able to embrace them is super important. It's much easier these days to deploy a model into production than it was, say, 5 or 6 years ago, or to try a whole host of models and pick the best one. It's much easier now than it was many years ago. And I think it's important for organizations to kind of embrace that, and also for data scientists to embrace it as well, to realize that this industry really is rapidly changing, and it's important to keep your eyes open to what tools are available to utilize on that front.
Amazing. Well, look, Andrew, this was great. We could continue, I think, and just go into detail into all kinds of stuff, but I'm afraid our time is up. I would love to have you on the show sometime in the future, maybe sharing a data story or the like. I'll definitely follow up with you. Any final word of advice that you would have for aspiring data leaders? Maybe people still at university, maybe people who are attracted by data in different business functions. Moving into this decade, what would be your final word of advice? And feel free to repeat yourself with some of the super important cliches that we might have already touched on.
I would say that the 80% rule, don't forget about that. It's incredibly important. There's very few days that I wake up and I'm not looking forward to what I'm doing, right? So it's a fun field to be in. So keep trudging forward. If that's your aspiration, get into it. It's a lot of fun. And I would work on some of the people aspects of what I talked about, right? Figure out the terminology of the people that you're working with in your team. So 80% rule, and then working on the people aspects. If you want to be a technology leader, I think those are the two most important things that I would say.
That's your 80-20 right there. That's the 20% of all the things that you should focus on will give 80% of the results. Amazing. I think we can finish on that note. Thank you very much, Andrew, for your insights. And we hope to see you back on the show someday.
Thank you. We'd love to.